Hey friends, Sonia here with Ellie and Mac today, and today we are going to talk about color blocking. Now I absolutely love color blocking, and that is when you add an extra seam where there wasn't a seam there before, and typically that is used for adding coordinating fabrics to create a lot of contrast, some interest in your sews. So this is an example of color blocking that I'll be showing you how to do today. Now the Be Creative Hoodie, which is the Ellie and Mac pattern that I'm using, already has a bit of color blocking here, and then I added this stripe around here to accentuate this panel of characters right here. So I think that that is such a fun way to go above and beyond in your sews. It's a fun way to spice up patterns that you already have, because you can add different seam lines and reverse cover stitching, which is something that I'm going to do with these sews as well, just to make those extra sections of fabric pop. Now we're going to be going through 3 different color blocks today. The first one is going to be the kids joggers, and I am using the plain view of the kids joggers and then adding color blocking at the knees to create knee patches. The second one is the Be Creative Hoodie, where I'm going to show you how I did this. And the third one is I'm really going to hack up the Urban Legs leggings and create just a super fun, very pieced legging with a pocket. So I'll show you how we do all of that, and go ahead and stick around. Make sure if you do have any questions, leave them in the comments below and let us know what else you want to see. Let's get started. So the first pattern I am using is the kids joggers, and I'm using the plain ones. They do come with a color blocking option over the thighs and the calves, but I wanted to add knee patches, so I'm just going to use the plain one. Now I like to sketch out what I want to do beforehand so I have a better idea of where I'm going to cut. For this one, I am just cutting the fronts, as the knee patches aren't going to go all the way around to the back. And I'm using a red marker to sketch where I want those knee patches. Now I folded from the ankle up to about the crotch to kind of mark the center so I'd have a better idea of where the knee is. And I'm just sketching out where I want that to be. Now next, and this is what I typically do for a very simple style of color block, is I just make a really thick line. That way I can cut right down the center of that thick line, and I've got red marks on either edge of my pattern piece. Those red marks remind me that I need to add seam allowances. If I'm doing a more complicated hack, I'll typically remake the pattern pieces, and I'll show you how to do that next. But all I'm going to do in this case is just write a little note on my pattern pieces to add seam allowance, which is the plus SA, at each of those cut lines. Now I just want to make sure that I remember to add that seam allowance, so that's why I write it on there twice with the red line and also the note. So when you're cutting out your pieces, all you're going to do is put your pattern piece down as you would normally, and anywhere that there's not a red mark is the original pattern, so we don't need to change anything there. But then along that top, you're going to add that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now this is a very simple color blocking that we're doing, so that is the reason that I'm not completely remaking all these pattern pieces, but just making that note to go ahead and add that seam allowance. So I'll do this with all 3 pieces of the front as you have seen, and add the seam allowance where there is the red lines, and anywhere there's not, just leave it per the pattern. Now we're going to go ahead and assemble our pants. I'm just laying everything out so that I know that the pieces are facing the right direction and clipping them, and what I'm going to do is serge and top stitch along both of those seams. So here are our new front pieces. That was super simple, and all you have to do is remember to add the seam allowance, which is made easier by making those notes on your pattern piece, and this is the final product. The next method I'm showing you, we are actually recreating our pattern pieces. Now this is the Be Creative Hoodie, which already has a bit of color blocking in the pattern, but I wanted to add a little bit more just to emphasize the design on this fabric. So what I did is I laid my pattern piece over the fabric and traced the group of characters so that I know that I wouldn't cut into them. And then I traced out where I want that new color blocking to be. Now since we're making new pattern pieces, because we have kind of a few and they're an interesting shape, what I'm going to do is trace this out. Now remember, where we have that curve, we are adding our 1/4 inch seam allowance. you can see the distance between where my line is and the original pattern piece. So you will want to make sure that there is that 1/4 inch there for your seam allowance. I'm going to do the same thing on the outside. Now around the top and the sides, there aren't any additions, but around that cut line, I'm also adding that seam allowance. So we're going to get rid of those original couple pieces because they don't have the seam allowance on them, and these are our new pattern pieces that we're going to use. Now this time you don't have to remember to add your seam allowance because we made new pattern pieces that include it. I like to do this when I am making a bit of a more complicated color block, and that way I don't accidentally forget. What you can do, like I'm doing here, is line this up and overlap the seam allowance, which is going to be 1/2 inch because we have 2 seam allowances at a 1/4 inch. And I'm going to make marks on my pattern just like you would normally have your notches for lining things up. It's going to make it a lot easier to line these pieces of fabric up later when you have those marks. So I marked mine with pins, and then I'm just going to go and clip everything together. That way I know that it's aligned perfectly. Now I'll take this over and sew that seam and top stitch. Now that we're back to that original pattern piece and we've got it color blocked, you can construct everything per pattern, and this is my finished product. The last color block I'm doing was inspiration from these Obsession leggings from Booty Queen Apparel. I really love the number of color blocks on these and really wanted to create my own. So I'm using the Urban Legs, and we're going to add side panels and a pocket. First thing I'm doing is folding my pattern piece in half to use as a gauge for where I'm adding my color blocking. So here's a diagram of where we're going to be adding those lines. The green dotted line is that center fold that I just made, and the red lines are where we are adding our color blocking. So I, again, kind of sketched out on a piece of paper right there where I wanted to add those seams, and then I'm using a clear ruler to add my color blocking pieces, and I periodically went back and forth from my inspiration photo to decide where I wanted these. The line on the front side is just slightly closer to that center fold than the back one, and then I used a French curve to create the curve that goes towards the back. Now I then added my final line, and I again used my ruler for this part, and then mirrored that exact same shape so that that would be an equal distance apart for that last stripe. The next part we're going to do is create our pocket piece using that center panel. So we're creating the base that goes against the skin and then the outer piece that makes the pocket. So what I did is I just laid my phone down to kind of gauge the size that I wanted that pocket just to make sure it fits. And next I'm going to create a bit of a curve, kind of like the inspiration photo, that goes from the front down towards the back. Now I labeled these pieces, and I'm going to cut out all of my new pattern pieces, and then we'll go ahead and make additional pieces for the pocket. You can see that I put 1, 2, and 3 on there so that I remember that the order that those go in and everything. Once you're adding this many color block pieces, it definitely helps to label them so that you can remember a little bit easier what order everything goes in. Now, of course, we are going to recreate these pattern pieces, and I am putting my tracing paper over the top. Now, along the crotch sides of the pattern pieces, I'm not adding any seam allowance, and that's because we didn't change those at all, but anywhere we created those extra cuts, I'm going in and adding all of my seam allowance. I really like I mentioned, to create new pattern pieces when I'm doing a color blocking with multiple pieces like this, just so I don't forget to add my seam allowance anywhere. So the crotch curve and that final line stay the same, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut out my new pattern pieces and just throw away those other ones so I don't accidentally use the ones that don't have seam allowance added. Now we're taking that center panel that we traced our pocket out, and we're going to cut at the bottom of the pocket. That number 3 piece is going to stay basically the same, just with added seam allowance on top. And then the top portion is going to be our base pocket, which is the part that goes against the skin. And just since I have the paper out, I'm going to trace my front piece as well. Now again, on the crotch side of the pattern piece, I am keeping that the same, and then I'm just adding seam allowance along where we added that extra seam. Now, when it gets to the center panel, you have to make sure and add your seam allowance on both sides because we added cuts on both sides. as well as adding a seam allowance along that cut that we just made along the panel for the pocket. Now I am again labeling these, and we're going to take that base piece and we're going to make our top layer of our pocket. So all I have to do is cut that off, and I'm going to trace that final layer. And again, if you think about how a pocket is constructed, you've got the base piece against your skin, and then you have another layer on top that creates the pocket. Now I'm adding seam allowance on both sides, and then I'm actually adding a hem allowance along the top so that I can fold it under to hem the top of my pocket. So on this piece, we're adding on all 4 sides. Don't forget to throw away any of these pieces that we're tracing, because those are the pieces without seam allowance and we don't need them anymore. Now before we cut our fabric, I'm going to do just like I did with the hoodie, and that is line everything up to make sure it works. So I've got my 2 pocket pieces on top of each other, and then when you're overlapping your seam allowances, make sure that because we use a 1/4 inch, you're overlapping them by 1/2 inch to accommodate for that. So I just like to go ahead and make sure that everything is going to fit together perfectly before I cut into my good fabric, because there is nothing worse than ruining your fabric. Everything looks perfect, so we can go ahead and cut out our fabric and get everything assembled. A little tip before you cut, what I like to do is take each of my pattern pieces and lay them on top of the fabric that I'm going to be cutting them out of. That way it's super clear which color blocking piece gets cut out of which fabric. I also find it's easier to keep everything clear this way, and then you know 100% if you have enough fabric for each of your pieces. Since we recreated all of our pattern pieces, we don't have to worry about adding seam allowance everywhere, since we already did that in making new pattern pieces. And I'm going to assemble mine from the pocket first. So I'm taking the exterior pocket piece and hemming the top of that, and then we'll go ahead and assemble that center panel and then the side panels that we added on. Now I'm going to take and add the bottom piece of my center panel, and I want to show you a mistake I made, and I've done this before, so I really should remember, but you have to make sure to align everything, and this is where those marks that we made in the hoodie come in handy, so you know where to line things up so that this offset doesn't happen. So I'm going to go ahead and rip that out and realign it so that my panels are straight. But just something to keep in mind when you're recreating your pattern pieces, that it often is really helpful to create marks for lining everything up so things like this don't happen. So now that those center panels are assembled and top stitched, I'm going to add the skinny pieces that point kind of towards the top of the bum. And I always like to lay everything out on my table so that I know that I'm adding the right side to the right side and that kind of thing. Now because we added a curve at the top, I'm going to pin as far as I can along that straight edge and then worry about that small curve at the top. That way I don't accidentally stretch the fabric or anything like that. Obviously where it's straight, everything is just pinned 1-to-1, and then I'll pick it up and work in that little curve and make sure I use lots of clips there. Then we're going to sew and top stitch. Alright, now the hard part of the pocket is done. All we have to do is add those front and back panels to create the rest of our leg pieces, and then we can assemble our leggings as normal. Now we did create straight lines up and down those legs, so again I'm going to pin as far as I can along that straight line before easing in the curve to make sure that nothing else gets stretched, and then we'll sew those, top stitch, and assemble our leggings as we would normally. I really love using a reverse cover stitch on athletic leggings. I think that it creates a really fun, bold accent. So if you want to know more about that, just let me know in the comments below. I did touch on it briefly in our video that goes through different hemming techniques, and basically to reverse cover stitch like this, I use 3 needles in my cover stitch machine and actually stitch it upside down, so all the loops that are normally against the skin are on the top, and it gives a really fun ready to wear look. And you can add pops of color or just dividing lines, where I did color blocking, but I used two of the same colors, it really accentuates that seam and all that extra work we did there to create that fun bit of interest in the side of our leggings. And we did it. We've got our leggings pieces assembled. Now we're just going to go through and finish our leggings off like you would normally, which is going to be sewing the crotch curves. Then you're going to sew the inseam and add your waistband. I love how these turned out, and the shapes are so close to my ready-to-wear inspiration, so this was a super fun color blocking hack. Thank you so much for joining me today, friends, and we'll see you in our next video.